In 1939, few people believed France could lose a war in 6 weeks. On paper, France fielded one of the strongest, most respected armies in the world. First, France possessed Europe's largest standing army after the Soviet Union. Mobilization plans allowed France to put over 5 million soldiers into the field. Much of Europe still remembered the French victory in World War I, when France had fought for 4 years on its own soil and emerged on the winning side. That legacy created a global belief in the French army's toughness and professionalism. Second, France had heavy industry capable of producing excellent weapons. French tanks like the Char B1 and the Saumur S-35 were among the most powerful armored vehicles in the world, better armored and better armed than most German Panzers. French artillery was considered some of the best in Europe, and the army had modern anti-tank guns, strong fortifications, and thousands of machine guns. Third, France invested enormous sums in the Maginot Line, one of the most advanced defensive systems ever built. Its underground bunkers, artillery turrets, and reinforced positions convinced both the French public and foreign observers that France's borders were nearly impregnable. Fourth, France had powerful allies. Britain had committed troops to defend France. Belgium was expected to help shield the northern frontier. Poland was fighting Germany in the east. To most analysts, Germany seemed surrounded and overstretched. Finally, France had global military experience. The French military was present in colonies around the world, policing vast territories and maintaining a massive professional officer corps. This created the image of a battle-tested empire capable of mobilizing worldwide resources. Because of all these factors, manpower, equipment, fortifications, alliances, and reputation, France was widely seen as the dominant military power in Western Europe. No one imagined that in 1940, this same army would collapse with shocking speed.
The Maginot Line is often remembered as a symbol of French failure, but the reality is far more complex. Built after World War I, it was one of the most advanced defensive systems ever constructed. Reinforced bunkers, underground railways, artillery turrets, air filtration, and thick concrete designed to stop another German invasion through Alsace and Lorraine. In those sectors, the Maginot Line worked exactly as intended. When Germany attacked in 1940, the French forts held out, resisted bombardment, and slowed German forces for weeks. Some positions didn't surrender until after France itself collapsed. But the myth comes from what the Maginot Line did not cover. France extended the line only to the Ardennes forest, assuming the terrain was too dense and rugged for a major armored offensive. The French believed no commander would push tanks through such difficult ground. Hitler and his generals proved them wrong. They sent their panzer divisions straight through the Ardennes, around the line, not through it. Another misconception is that the Maginot Line drained resources from the rest of the French military. In reality, the budget spent on it was relatively small compared to France's overall defense spending. The real problem wasn't money, it was strategy. French military doctrine relied on slow mobilization, static defense, and rigid command structures. The army prepared to fight the next war like the last one, assuming Germany would repeat its 1914 attacks. The Maginot Line also wasn't meant to stand alone. It depended on Belgium remaining an ally. When Belgium declared neutrality in 1936, France lost the ability to extend the line to the sea, leaving a critical gap that German forces later exploited. Ultimately, the line failed not because it was weak, but because France misjudged how Germany would fight. The Maginot Line was a strong shield, Germany simply walked around it. Its legacy became a symbol of inflexibility, illustrating how even the best defenses are useless when strategy fails.
For decades, French planners believed the Ardennes forest was a natural barrier no army could penetrate. Dense woods, narrow roads, steep hills, and thick terrain made it seem impossible for tanks, artillery, and mechanized forces to cross quickly. French intelligence labeled the region simply as impenetrable. This assumption became one of the most disastrous miscalculations in modern military history. In reality, the Ardennes wasn't impossible, just difficult. And difficulty was not a deterrent to the German high command. General Erich von Manstein proposed a bold plan: push the bulk of Germany's armored divisions directly through the forest, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot line and the main Allied armies assembled in Belgium. The French command dismissed the idea that Germany would even try it. Their reconnaissance was outdated, and their doctrine assumed tanks couldn't operate effectively on narrow, twisting roads. But Germany prepared meticulously. Engineers surveyed routes in secret. Traffic officers practiced managing miles-long columns. Panzers trained for tight convoys and rapid deployment tactics. In May 1940, the gamble paid off. More than 40,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery, fuel carriers moved through the Ardennes in just a few days. Local French defenders were lightly equipped, poorly supported, and caught off guard. By the time French command realized the breakthrough was real, German tanks were already emerging from the forest and racing toward the Meuse River. The Ardennes wasn't impenetrable. It was simply underestimated. The real failure was strategic thinking, not geography. France trusted the forest more than its own mobile forces, and Germany exploited that blind spot with speed, coordination, and audacity. The fall of France began the moment the impossible became possible inside the Ardennes.
The Manstein Plan was one of the most brilliant and risky operational blueprints of World War II. It transformed Germany's invasion of France from a predictable assault into a strategic masterstroke that completely fooled the Allies. Early German plans looked like a repeat of World War I, a broad, sweeping attack through Belgium. The Allies expected this and prepared for it. France and Britain rushed their best armies north the moment Germany invaded Belgium and the Netherlands. That was exactly what Germany wanted. General Erich von Manstein proposed a radical alternative. Instead of putting the main effort in Belgium, he suggested using that attack as a decoy. The real knockout blow would come through the Ardennes, a route the Allies believed was too difficult for armored divisions. To the Allies, it looked like Germany was using a familiar plan. But behind the scenes, 7 panzer divisions, the bulk of Germany's armored strength, were pushing through the forest in one massive formation. Once they emerged, they struck at the Meuse River near Sedan. This was the weakest point on the entire Allied line. Tired reserve units, poorly supported, with almost no anti-tank defenses. On May 13th, German forces forced a crossing in just hours. The French command didn't believe the scale of the breakthrough at first. They thought it was a diversion. By the time they realized it was the main attack, German tanks were already pouring across the bridges and expanding the breach. Then came the decisive move. The Panzers did not turn south to attack the Maginot line. They turned west, straight behind the Allied armies that had rushed into Belgium. This maneuver cut off the Allies from their supply lines and trapped the British Expeditionary Force and several French armies at the coast. The result was the collapse of Allied coordination, the fall of northern France, and the evacuation at Dunkirk. The genius of the Manstein Plan wasn't raw strength. It was deception, speed, and exploiting Allied assumptions. Germany didn't overpower France. They outthought them.
Manstein turned the Ardennes from a supposed obstacle into the battlefield that decided the fate of Western Europe.
The Allies didn't lose France in 1940 because they lacked strength. They lost because they misunderstood what Germany was trying to do. In the months before the invasion, French and British intelligence focused on German force movements in northern Germany, exactly where they expected an attack. The logic was simple. Germany had invaded Belgium the same way in 1914, and the geography still favored a northern advance. So the Allies convinced themselves the Germans would repeat history. Every piece of evidence was interpreted through that lens. A German buildup in the north, proof of the plan. Sporadic activity in the Ardennes, dismissed as unimportant. Reports warning of armored divisions moving toward the forest, brushed aside as impossible. This mindset shaped Allied deployment. Their strongest armies, the British Expeditionary Force and France's best mobile divisions, were positioned in Belgium, waiting for what they assumed was the main strike. But Germany's actual plan was far more deceptive. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields and cities across Belgium and the Netherlands to reinforce the illusion of a northern offensive. German paratroopers seized key bridges, feeding the narrative that the attack was unfolding as expected. Meanwhile, the real Schwerpunkt, the concentrated armored blow, was moving silently through the Ardennes. French intelligence also suffered from deeper issues. The command structure was slow, rigid, and burdened by outdated assumptions from World War I. French officers believed tanks were support weapons, not instruments of breakthrough. So when reports mentioned massive tank columns in the forest, commanders dismissed them as exaggerated. Even when the Germans began crossing the Meuse at Sedan, the French high command hesitated. They assumed it was a diversion. The idea that the main German attack was happening where they believed a major attack was impossible simply didn't fit their worldview. By the time the Allies realized the truth, German armor had already broken through and was racing to the Channel. Their best forces were out of position, and the chance to counterattack was lost. The Allies misread German intentions because they trusted assumptions instead of evidence. They planned for the last war, while Germany prepared for a new one. In 1940, the battlefield wasn't just France, it was the Allied mind, and Germany outmaneuvered them there first.
The Dyle plan was meant to save France. Instead, it helped doom the French army in just weeks. After World War I, French strategists assumed that if Germany invaded again, they would attack through Belgium, just as they had in 1914. To avoid fighting on French soil and to protect the industrial north, France devised the Dyle plan. The moment Germany crossed into Belgium, the French army and the British Expeditionary Force would rush forward, take up defensive positions along the Dyle River, and stop the invasion early. On paper, it made sense. The line was short, defensible, and allowed France to keep the war outside its borders. But in practice, the plan created a strategic trap. First, it required lightning-fast movement. French and British divisions had to advance more than 100 kilometers at high speed, with tanks, artillery, and supply convoys stretched along narrow roads. This meant that when the Germans attacked, the Allies would be moving, not defending, and moving armies are vulnerable. Second, the plan assumed the main German attack would come through central Belgium, but that was exactly what Germany wanted the Allies to believe. The invasion of Belgium and the airborne assaults on Dutch airfields were deliberate distractions designed to activate the Dyle plan. As the Allies committed their best troops, France's most modern armored divisions, and the entire British Expeditionary Force, Germany executed the real operation elsewhere. 7 Panzer divisions were pushing through the Ardennes, a region the Dyle plan completely ignored. While Allied forces raced forward into Belgium, The Germans were already breaking through the weakly defended Meuse sector behind them. The Allies didn't know it, but they were marching into a trap, leaving their flanks open and their supply lines extended. Third, once the Allies were in Belgium, retreating became nearly impossible. Their forces were too far forward, too committed, and too interlocked with Belgian forces to pull back quickly. When German tanks sliced through at Sedan and drove toward the Channel, the Allied position collapsed. They were cut off, surrounded, and forced toward Dunkirk. The Dyle plan was not just flawed, it was predictable. It locked France into a rigid response that Germany exploited with perfect timing. In 1940, France didn't lose because it was weak. It lost because its strategy was obvious, inflexible, and tailored to a world that no longer existed.
General Maurice Gamelin was the supreme commander of French forces in 1940, one of the most powerful military positions in Europe. But he fought the next war with the mindset of the last one, and that proved fatal. Gamelin was a hero of World War I, a master of methodical, slow, carefully controlled operations. In 1918, that approach worked. In 1940, it was hopelessly outdated. His first mistake was assuming the Germans would repeat 1914. He built his entire strategy, especially the Dyle plan, on the idea that Germany would attack through Belgium in a predictable, linear way. He ignored evidence that Germany had rethought its own doctrine and embraced Blitzkrieg, fast, armored warfare driven by radios, coordination, and rapid decision-making. His second mistake was rejecting mobility. Gamelin believed tanks were infantry support weapons, not breakthrough tools. That meant French armored units were scattered, slow to respond, and unable to deliver concentrated counterblows. Meanwhile, German panzer divisions acted as unified, decisive spearheads. Then there was communication. Gamelin ran the French command system from a bunker outside Paris with no direct radio link to frontline units. Orders were delivered by telephone and motorcycle courier. By the time his commands reached the field, the situation had already changed, sometimes completely. His age and leadership style mattered too. Gamelin was cautious, distant, and painfully slow in making decisions. He rarely visited the front. He preferred paperwork to battlefield intuition. In a war of hours, he took days. During the German breakthrough at Sedan, Gamelin's response was disastrously delayed. He believed the attack was a diversion. He hesitated to release armored reserves. He failed to coordinate a counterattack when it might still have made a difference. By the time he realized the scale of the crisis, German forces were already across the Meuse and racing toward the Channel. The window to stop them was gone. Gamelin wasn't a coward or a fool. He was a highly competent general, fighting the wrong kind of war. But in 1940, that was enough to doom France. He was a commander stuck in 1918, while Germany was already fighting 1940.
Blitzkrieg wasn't just about tanks. It was a system, a way of fighting that France was completely unprepared to counter. When Germany invaded in 1940, the French army was still built around World War I assumptions: slow offensives, heavy artillery, rigid lines, and centralized command. Blitzkrieg shattered every one of those ideas. The core of Blitzkrieg was speed and coordination. German tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft worked together as one unified force. They communicated through radios in every tank and coordinated their movements almost in real time. This allowed German panzer divisions to exploit weak points, break through rapidly, and drive deep behind enemy lines before the defenders could react. France, meanwhile, operated at a completely different tempo. Most French tanks had no radios, making coordination slow and chaotic. Their armored units were scattered across the front, used to support infantry rather than strike independently. and their high command needed hours, sometimes days, to process reports and issue orders. Blitzkrieg turned that delay into disaster. Another key element was air power. The Luftwaffe didn't just bomb targets, it isolated the battlefield, smashed communication networks, and prevented the French from moving reserves. German units advanced under a protective umbrella of Stukas and fighters, while French aircraft were fragmented and poorly coordinated. Blitzkrieg also relied on psychological shock. German armor didn't just stop once it broke through, it surged forward relentlessly, creating panic and confusion. French commanders believed breakthroughs could be contained with local counterattacks. But German tanks didn't just punch the line, they drove 20, 30, 50 kilometers past it, creating chaos that French doctrine simply couldn't manage. France tried to respond, but its system worked against it. Orders traveled too slowly, units were too dispersed, leadership was too rigid. And by the time France recognized Blitzkrieg as the main threat, German spearheads were already behind them, cutting supply lines, encircling armies, and collapsing the entire front. France wasn't defeated by superior numbers or superior tanks. It was defeated by a faster, more flexible way of thinking. Blitzkrieg overwhelmed France not because it was unstoppable, but because France was unable to adapt to a war that moved faster than its entire command structure. In 1940, the battlefield belonged to whoever could think and act the fastest. And Germany's Blitzkrieg made sure that wasn't France.
In 1940, France actually had some of the best tanks in the world. The Char B-1 and the Somua S-35 were heavily armored, well-armed, and capable of taking on German Panzers in head-to-head combat. By technical standards, French armor was often superior to German tanks. So why didn't this advantage stop Germany's advance? The answer lies in tactics, deployment, and doctrine. French tanks were scattered across infantry units and used primarily for support. They were slow, lacked radios, and often acted alone. If a French tank met German armor, it could win the fight, but only locally. Without coordination, individual victories didn't translate into operational success. German Panzers, by contrast, were fast, concentrated, and coordinated. Radio-equipped, they moved in combined arms formations with infantry, artillery, and aircraft. This allowed Germany to exploit weak points, bypass strong points, and encircle French units. Another factor was speed and initiative. French tank crews waited for orders from higher command. German panzer commanders were empowered to act on the ground, make quick decisions, and push the attack forward. And finally, logistics and support mattered. French tanks were heavily armored but consumed fuel quickly and were difficult to repair in the field. German supply chains were lighter and more flexible, keeping panzers moving for days without pause. In short, French tanks were powerful, but they fought the last war. German panzers fought the War of 1940. Technology alone couldn't win. It was the use of tanks in a fast, coordinated strategy that gave Germany the decisive edge. The Tank War of 1940 wasn't about who had the better machine. It was about who could use it faster, smarter, and in unison with the entire army. And in that battle, France lost before the first shot was even fired.
In 1940, the German army had one key advantage that often goes unnoticed: communications and mobility. While France had strong forces and advanced tanks, they lacked the systems to use them effectively in a fast-moving battle. German units were equipped with radios in nearly every tank and command vehicle, allowing commanders on the ground to communicate instantly. Orders could adapt to changing situations, reinforcements could be redirected, and breakthroughs could be exploited immediately. This created a fluid, flexible fighting force that reacted faster than the French High Command could even process reports. The French army, by contrast, relied heavily on telephones, runners, and fixed communication lines. Tank crews often had no radios at all. If a unit encountered a German advance or breakthrough, it had to wait for orders to trickle down from headquarters, sometimes hours or even a full day later. By the time the French reacted, the battlefield had already changed. Mobility compounded the problem. German panzer divisions were fast, concentrated, and coordinated with motorized infantry and artillery. They could bypass strong points, exploit weak areas, and encircle entire French divisions. French forces were slower, dispersed, and poorly mechanized. Even the best tanks couldn't move quickly enough to plug gaps or counter a sudden thrust. The combination of radio communications and high mobility created a decisive operational advantage. German units didn't just win battles, they created chaos, broke supply lines, and paralyzed the French command structure. France had numbers and firepower, but they couldn't move or communicate fast enough to respond effectively. In the end, Germany's victory was as much about coordination and speed as it was about weapons or manpower. Where the French relied on rigid plans and slow orders, the Germans relied on flexible, mobile command, and that difference shattered France in 1940.
The Battle of Sedan was the moment France's defenses collapsed. It was here, at a quiet stretch of the Meuse River, that Germany executed the decisive maneuver of the 1940 campaign. French planners believed Sedan, with its steep riverbanks and fortifications, was secure. Heavy artillery, infantry, and some tank units were deployed to slow any attack. They assumed the Ardennes, crossed by the Germans just days earlier, would only be a minor threat. But Germany's plan was bold. 7 panzer divisions, supported by motorized infantry and the Luftwaffe, struck simultaneously. Using coordinated artillery barrages and air support, they forced crossings at multiple points. The French defenses were overwhelmed in hours, not days. Communication failures worsened the disaster. French commanders didn't know the scale of the German assault. Orders to reinforce or counterattack were delayed or misdirected. By the time reserves arrived, the Germans had already secured bridgeheads and were pushing westward. The breakthrough at Sedan was more than a local defeat. It was a strategic collapse. German armor poured through the gap, cutting the French army in two and isolating forces to the north. Allied plans, including the Dyle plan, became irrelevant overnight. The British Expeditionary Force and multiple French armies found themselves trapped in Belgium and northern France, setting the stage for the evacuation at Dunkirk. Sedan proved that France's strongest fortifications and best troops could be bypassed and outmaneuvered. It was not a failure of courage or skill, but of doctrine, planning, and anticipation. The disaster at Sedan didn't just lose a battle, it decided the war in France's collapse. The crossing of the Meuse River in May 1940 was one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. In just 24 hours, German forces turned a seemingly secure French line into a pathway for Blitzkrieg. French commanders assumed the Meuse, with its steep banks, narrow bridges, and river defenses, was a natural barrier. They expected an attack to take days, if not longer, to organize and execute. What they didn't anticipate was the speed, coordination, and surprise of German forces. The assault began with intense artillery bombardments aimed at French fortifications and strongpoints along the riverbanks. At the same time, the Luftwaffe unleashed waves of Stuka dive bombers targeting bridges, roads, and defensive positions. The French were disoriented and unable to concentrate forces effectively. German engineers played a critical role. They rapidly repaired damaged bridges, constructed temporary crossings, and ensured tanks and infantry could flow across the river without delay. Within hours, the 1st Panzer divisions were already on the west side, moving deep into French territory. French reserves were slow to respond. Orders were delayed, units were mispositioned, and communication lines were cut by air attacks. By the time French commanders realized the scale of the crossing, German tanks had already created gaps on the defensive line, making counterattacks nearly impossible. The Meuse crossing was not just a tactical success, it was a strategic masterstroke. It allowed German forces to bypass the Maginot Line, encircle the northern Allied armies, and initiate a rapid advance toward the Channel. The speed and decisiveness of the operation shattered French morale and disrupted every defensive plan the Allies had. In 1940, the Meuse wasn't just a river, it was the gateway through which Germany shattered France. In 24 hours, what was thought to be a secure line became the beginning of the end.
In 1940, France had one of the largest air forces in the world. On paper, it could challenge the Luftwaffe and protect the front. In practice, it failed, and the reasons reveal why France collapsed so quickly. First, organization and doctrine were outdated. French air units were divided by role, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, but they lacked coordinated command. Pilots often had to operate without clear orders or support from ground units. Unlike the Germans, there was no unified system for combined arms operations. Second, technology and deployment were problematic. Many French aircraft were slow, underarmed, or outdated. They were stationed in dispersed airfields, making rapid concentration difficult. When the Luftwaffe struck, French planes were scattered and vulnerable to air attacks, often destroyed on the ground before they could fight. Third, training and readiness were insufficient. Pilots lacked experience in modern, fast-paced combat. Maintenance and logistics couldn't keep up with sudden demands. Planes that could have made a difference often weren't operational when they were most needed. Fourth, reaction speed was critical, and the French lagged. The Luftwaffe used Stuka dive bombers and fighters to hit defensive positions, supply lines, and communication networks. French air units were slow to respond, allowing German armor to advance unimpeded. Finally, coordination with ground forces failed. German air power was integrated with Panzer divisions, creating a deadly combined arms system. French aircraft rarely supported frontline troops effectively, leaving infantry and tanks exposed. In short, France didn't lose the air war because it lacked planes. It lost because it lacked coordination, speed, and integration. The Luftwaffe didn't just dominate the skies, they dominated the battlefield, making French forces vulnerable at every level. Air power wasn't just about control of the sky, it was about enabling movement, protecting forces, and disrupting the enemy. In 1940, France failed on all counts.
In May 1940, Belgium became the stage for one of the most critical failures of the Allied defense. The Belgian front was supposed to slow the German advance, buying time for French and British forces to engage effectively. Instead, it collapsed rapidly, opening the path to northern France. Belgium had declared neutrality, but its army was relatively small and ill-prepared for a modern, fast-moving war. When German forces invaded on May 10th, Belgian troops faced the full weight of Blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions, motorized infantry, and relentless air support. The speed and coordination of the German attack overwhelmed defensive positions before reinforcements could arrive. The Allies had committed their best forces north under the Dyle plan, expecting to stop the Germans in Belgium. But the Belgian army couldn't hold long enough, and the German advance quickly outflanked French and British units. Allied divisions were forced into hurried retreats, exposing gaps along the front and leaving vital roads and bridges undefended.
Communication failures made the situation worse. Belgian, French, and British commands struggled to coordinate, often working with incomplete or outdated information. German aerial attacks disrupted radios and lines of communication, creating chaos in the command structure. As Belgian resistance faltered, German tanks raced west toward the English Channel. By the time French and British forces realized the magnitude of the collapse, the northern armies were cut off, setting the stage for the Dunkirk evacuation. The collapse of the Belgian front wasn't due to cowardice. It was a combination of overwhelming German speed, lack of preparedness, and strategic miscalculations by the Allies. Belgium's fall exposed the vulnerability of Allied planning and highlighted how Blitzkrieg turned expectations into traps. In 1940, the Belgian front didn't just fall, it opened the door to the swift defeat of France.
In May 1940, the Netherlands became the first domino in Germany's lightning campaign through Western Europe. Although small, its fall had major consequences for France and the Allies. The Dutch army, though well-trained, was ill-equipped to withstand the combined arms of the German Blitzkrieg. Paratroopers seized key airfields, allowing the Luftwaffe to rapidly deploy forces deep inside the country. German bombers struck strategic points, while armored units advanced through lightly defended sectors. Within days, the Netherlands was overwhelmed. For France, the Dutch collapse had strategic and psychological effects. The Dyle plan, which relied on Allied forces moving into Belgium and northern Holland to halt the Germans, was disrupted. Allied units had to adjust their lines, stretching their troops thinner and creating gaps that the Germans quickly exploited. What was supposed to be a solid defensive front became fragmented and vulnerable. The rapid fall of the Netherlands also demonstrated the effectiveness of German combined arms tactics. Air power, paratroopers, and fast-moving armored divisions worked in concert, something the French military was not prepared to counter. It sent shockwaves through the Allied command, undermining confidence and causing hesitation in decision-making at critical moments. Finally, the Dutch capitulation opened up key routes for German forces to advance into Belgium and northern France. French and British forces, already committed under the Dyle plan, now faced a situation far more precarious than anticipated. The speed of the German victories left them reacting instead of controlling the battlefield. The fall of the Netherlands was more than the loss of a neighboring country. It set the stage for France's rapid collapse. It proved that Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, but a strategic weapon, reshaping the entire Western Front in days.
By late May 1940, the German Blitzkrieg had sliced through northern France and Belgium, leaving the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and the best French armies trapped along the coast. Dunkirk became the symbol of both disaster and desperate survival. German armored divisions had pushed westward to the English Channel, cutting off the northern Allied armies from reinforcements and supplies. The Allies faced encirclement with no clear escape routes, and German forces closing in from the south and east. Their best tanks, artillery, and troops were at risk of annihilation. The French command initially struggled to react. Communication breakdowns, panic, and confusion delayed coordinated counterattacks. Local units fought bravely, but isolated resistance could not stop the German advance. The Allies were caught in a strategic trap, largely of their own making. By advancing into Belgium under the Dyle plan, they had overextended and left themselves vulnerable. At Dunkirk, a miracle of improvisation took place. The Royal Navy, supported by hundreds of civilian vessels, evacuated over 338,000 soldiers across the Channel. The evacuation saved the British Army from complete destruction, but the French troops remained largely behind. The bulk of France's best-equipped units, armored divisions, infantry, and elite formations were lost or immobilized. The encirclement at Dunkirk shattered France's defensive capacity. Even with reinforcements, the northern armies could no longer mount effective resistance. The Germans had effectively removed
France's elite forces from the battlefield without a single decisive set-piece battle. In the end, Dunkirk was both a heroic escape and a strategic catastrophe. France had lost its best armies, its northern front collapsed, and the path to Paris lay wide open. The events at Dunkirk sealed the fate of France in 1940.
One of the most debated questions of World War II is why Germany allowed over 330,000 British and Allied troops to evacuate from Dunkirk in 1940. The answer lies in strategy, logistics, and a mix of caution and overconfidence. By late May, German armored divisions had reached the Channel, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and northern French armies. Hitler issued a halt order, stopping the Panzers from attacking Dunkirk directly. Several reasons influenced this decision. First, logistics and terrain. The ground around Dunkirk was flooded and crisscrossed with canals, making rapid armored advances risky. German supply lines were stretched thin, and commanders worried that pressing forward could expose tanks to counterattacks or bog them down in marshes. Second, the Luftwaffe's role. German high command believed the Air Force could finish the job. Dive bombers and fighters attacked ports, roads, and troops, slowing the evacuation and inflicting casualties without risking valuable armored units. Third, political considerations. Hitler hoped to negotiate peace with Britain after defeating France. Allowing British forces to escape preserved the possibility of a future settlement, keeping Britain intact as a potential ally, or at least not a desperate enemy. Finally, command caution and overconfidence. German generals, still impressed by the rapid victories, feared unnecessary losses. They trusted that the trapped armies would eventually be defeated without committing their armored divisions to high-risk assaults in difficult terrain. The result was paradoxical. While the German army maintained the strategic advantage, the British evacuation preserved an army that would later be crucial in continuing the fight against Germany. Dunkirk became a symbol of survival, but for Germany, it was a missed opportunity to completely eliminate Britain's field forces in 1940. In short, Hitler's combination of caution, misjudgment, and reliance on the Luftwaffe allowed the British to escape, but the decision also reflected a strategic calculation that would have consequences for the rest of the war.
In May 1940, the German advance through the Ardennes and across the Meuse created a dramatic situation, a race to the English Channel that would determine the fate of France. As German armored divisions broke through Sedan, the Allies realized too late that their northern armies were vulnerable. French and British forces were moving into Belgium under the Dyle plan, expecting a conventional attack, while the Germans had already bypassed them through the Ardennes. German panzer divisions pushed west at incredible speed, racing along the roads toward the Channel ports. Their goal was simple but deadly: cut France in half, trapping Allied armies in the north and isolating them from reinforcements, supplies, and retreat routes. The Allies scrambled. French and British commanders tried to reposition their forces to block the German thrust, but they were slow, hampered by rigid communication, and unaware of the full scale of the breakthrough. Units collided in chaos, roads clogged with retreating troops, and bridges became bottlenecks. By the time the Germans reached the Channel, the northern armies were encircled. The Dyle plan, which had seemed solid, had turned into a strategic trap, leaving the British Expeditionary Force and elite French units cut off from the rest of France. The speed and coordination of the German advance demonstrated the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg, concentrated armored thrusts, integrated with air support and flexible command. France was not just losing ground, it was being divided and paralyzed before it could respond.
The race to the Channel wasn't just a maneuver, it was the moment the war in France became irreversibly lost. It set the stage for Dunkirk and the collapse of the Northern Front, proving that in 1940, speed and initiative mattered more than numbers or fortifications.
In the Battle of France, one of the most decisive but overlooked factors was communication. The difference between German and French radios played a critical role in the speed and effectiveness of operations. The German army had embraced modern radio communications. Nearly every Panzer and command vehicle was equipped with a radio, allowing units to report, receive orders, and coordinate in real time. This gave German commanders flexibility to exploit breakthroughs, adjust to enemy movements, and maintain momentum, the backbone of Blitzkrieg. French forces, on the other hand, were hampered by outdated systems. Most tanks lacked radios entirely. Infantry and artillery relied on telephones or runners to carry messages. Orders had to travel through multiple layers of command before reaching the front line, often arriving too late to be effective. The result was chaos. When German tanks appeared unexpectedly, French units struggled to respond. Counterattacks were poorly coordinated, reinforcements were delayed, and gaps in the lines remained unfilled. Even well-trained units could not act decisively without timely communication. This gap in technology and doctrine magnified the effects of German speed. Where Germany could strike, regroup, and push forward, French units were isolated and slow, unable to react before the situation had changed. The Allied command structure was paralyzed by information lag, while the Germans maintained a real-time picture of the battlefield. In the end, it wasn't just tanks or strategy that defeated France, it was the ability to communicate and adapt faster than the enemy. The French may have had strong forces on paper, but their radios, or lack thereof, left them blind, slow, and unable to stop the Blitzkrieg.
In 1940, France possessed some of the most powerful tanks in the world. The Char B-1 was heavily armored and could take out German Panzers head-on. The Somoua S-35 combined speed, firepower, and protection, making it arguably superior to most German tanks of the time. Yet, despite these advantages, French tanks failed to stop the German advance. The reasons weren't technological, they were tactical, doctrinal, and organizational. First, deployment. French tanks were scattered across infantry units, used primarily for support rather than concentrated offensives. A Char B-1 might defeat a German tank in a duel, but alone it couldn't change the outcome of a larger battle. Second, communication. Most French tanks lacked radios, preventing coordination on the battlefield. German Panzers, with radios in every vehicle, could operate as a unified force, exploiting breakthroughs and reacting instantly to threats. Third, doctrine and mindset. French commanders saw tanks as infantry support, not as independent shock troops. German commanders, by contrast, used tanks as the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, striking fast and deep to encircle and paralyze enemy forces. Fourth, combined arms. French tanks often advanced without sufficient infantry, artillery, or air support. German panzers were integrated with motorized infantry and the Luftwaffe, creating a deadly synergy that French armor couldn't match. In short, French tanks were technically superior, but they fought the last war. They were powerful, but too slow, poorly coordinated, and misused. Meanwhile, German tanks were faster, better integrated, and used in a doctrine that France was not prepared to counter. By 1940, victory didn't go to the strongest tank, it went to the army that knew how to fight fast, together, and decisively. French tanks could win battles, but Germany won the war.
As German Blitzkrieg swept through northern France in May 1940, the battlefield wasn't the only place chaos reigned. The roads of France became scenes of panic, confusion, and mass retreat, amplifying the military collapse. French and Belgian civilians fleeing advancing German forces clogged highways with cars, carts, and bicycles. Soldiers found themselves stuck behind civilian traffic, slowing counterattacks and leaving defensive positions empty. Orders that might have stopped German advances arrived too late, as units struggled simply to reach the front. Morale among French troops was fragile. Many soldiers had never faced the speed and coordination of Blitzkrieg. Witnessing tanks and aircraft advancing seemingly everywhere at once created fear, uncertainty, and paralysis. Rumors spread faster than facts, and panic often overtook discipline. The breakdown of morale wasn't limited to the rank and file. Commanders faced conflicting reports, delayed communications, and the pressure of managing a collapsing front. Hesitation became common, and French units often retreated prematurely or failed to counterattack when opportunities existed. Even elite units, including armored divisions, felt the psychological strain. When leaders were indecisive and coordination failed, the soldiers' confidence faltered. The faster the Germans advanced, the harder it became for French forces to maintain cohesion. In the end, the panic on the roads mirrored the collapse at the front. Blitzkrieg didn't just destroy French defenses, it crushed morale, turning organized armies into fleeing columns. The roads of France in 1940 were not just pathways, they were symbols of a nation unraveling under shock and speed.
During the German invasion of France in 1940, the countryside and highways became clogged with millions of fleeing civilians, creating an unforeseen but devastating impact on military operations. Refugee columns of cars, carts, and pedestrians blocked key roads, slowing troop movements, artillery deployment, and supply convoys. French units often couldn't reach their defensive positions on time, leaving critical gaps that German forces exploited with speed and precision. The logistics system collapsed under the pressure. Supplies of food, ammunition, and fuel could not move efficiently. Even well-stocked depots became inaccessible due to traffic jams and disrupted railways. Armored units, despite their technical superiority, were immobilized at crucial moments simply because they couldn't reach the battlefield. The psychological impact was equally severe. Soldiers trapped behind civilian columns grew frustrated and demoralized. Commanders, unable to control movements or predict troop positions, often hesitated or issued orders that were impossible to execute. This compounded the chaos of the retreat, turning a controlled withdrawal into a panicked flight in many sectors. Civilian movements weren't the root cause of France's defeat, but they amplified the effects of Blitzkrieg, creating confusion, delays, and vulnerability. In a war defined by speed, the refugee columns became an involuntary tool of disruption, accelerating the collapse of French resistance and the nation's defenses. By late May 1940, it was clear the roads of France were no longer just supply routes. They had become choke points of disorder, contributing directly to the unraveling of the French army and the nation's defenses.
On May 28, 1940, Belgium surrendered to Germany, delivering a sudden and severe shock to the Allied defensive line. The collapse of Belgium's army didn't just end Belgian resistance, it exposed the northern flank of France and the British Expeditionary Force. Belgium had been expected to hold long enough for French and British forces to consolidate defenses along the Dyle and Escaut rivers. Instead, rapid German advances, combined with airborne assaults and mobile armored units, overwhelmed Belgian positions in just 18 days. The surrender left vast gaps in the Allied lines,
roads and key towns undefended, and the northern front completely vulnerable. For France, the consequences were immediate and severe. French armies that had advanced into Belgium under the Dyle plan suddenly found themselves isolated, their flanks unprotected, and supply lines stretched. Communication became chaotic, reinforcements were delayed, and the British Expeditionary Force faced the real risk of encirclement. The shock wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. The rapid fall of a neighboring country eroded morale among French troops and commanders, feeding panic on the roads and hesitation in decision-making. Soldiers questioned whether any defensive plan could hold against German speed and coordination. Belgium's surrender highlighted the fragility of Allied planning. Rigid assumptions about how Germany would fight, combined with over-reliance on Allied cooperation, turned the fall of a single nation into a trigger for the collapse of the entire Northern Front. In 1940, Belgium's surrender wasn't just a local defeat, it was a catalyst for the unraveling of France itself, paving the way for the Germans to push deeper into the heart of Western Europe.
By mid-June 1940, the German Blitzkrieg had shattered the northern French front, and the Allies were in full retreat. Paris, the heart of France, fell without a single major battle, a symbolic and strategic blow that marked the collapse of the nation. French commanders faced a grim reality. The northern armies had been cut off, the Belgian front had collapsed, and the roads were clogged with retreating troops and fleeing civilians. Paris was no longer defensible without risking massive civilian casualties and complete destruction. On June 10th, the French government declared Paris an open city, ordering troops to withdraw and preventing urban combat. The decision was controversial, but reflected the impossibility of holding the city given the state of French forces and logistics. German forces entered Paris on June 14th, encountering little resistance. The occupation was almost ceremonial, yet it had profound consequences. The fall of Paris shocked the French population, demoralized the military, and symbolized the end of organized resistance in northern France. The surrender of Paris without a fight also allowed Germany to redirect forces elsewhere, consolidating their control over the country and preparing for further operations in Western Europe. It demonstrated that in 1940, speed, coordination, and strategic planning could achieve victory without prolonged battles, while indecision and systemic flaws in command could lead to collapse. The fall of Paris was more than a military event. It was a psychological defeat, signaling that France's era as a dominant European power had temporarily ended and setting the stage for occupation and the Vichy regime.
By June 1940, France was reeling from the rapid German advance, the collapse of its northern armies, and the fall of Paris. In this moment of national crisis, Marshal Philippe Petain, a celebrated hero of World War I, rose to power. Petain was seen as a figure of stability and authority. His reputation from the Battle of Verdun lent him immense credibility at a time when confidence in French leadership was shattered. On June 16, 1940, he was appointed Prime Minister, tasked with navigating a country on the brink of total defeat. Facing a military situation that was rapidly deteriorating, Petain made a decisive and controversial choice. He sought an armistice with Germany. Believing that continued resistance would lead to needless destruction and civilian suffering, he opted for what he presented as a pragmatic solution, though one that would define him as a figure of compromise and collaboration. Under Petain's leadership,
the French government negotiated terms with Germany that divided the country, leaving the north under occupation and establishing the Vichy regime in the south. Petain framed this as a way to preserve French sovereignty, maintain some degree of control, and protect the population from total devastation. Yet, history would judge him harshly. From hero of Verdun to architect of defeat, Petain's decision marked a turning point, not just for the French military, but for the nation itself. His rise symbolized both the collapse of resistance and the beginning of a period of occupation, collaboration, and national trauma. The story of Petain's ascent is a reminder that leadership in crisis can transform national heroes into controversial figures, especially when survival is weighed against honor and resistance.
On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany at Compiègne, the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The location was no accident. It was Hitler's symbolic act of revenge for Germany's humiliation in World War I. The armistice imposed harsh terms on France. Northern and western France came under German occupation, while the south was governed by the Vichy regime, a nominally independent French government under Marshal Petain. Germany controlled military, economic, and strategic matters, effectively neutralizing French power for the foreseeable future. Hitler's choice of Compiègne was a psychological weapon as much as a military one. By forcing France to surrender in the very carriage of its own past victory, he humiliated the nation and sent a message of personal and national vengeance. It was propaganda, intimidation, and punishment all in one act. For France, the armistice was devastating. The French army had been defeated, key territories occupied, and the population subjected to German control. Political and military leaders had little choice but to comply, hoping to preserve some measure of stability and protect civilians from further destruction. The Compiègne Armistice marked a turning point in Western Europe. France was no longer a major player in the conflict, while Germany gained a free hand to consolidate its victories and prepare for further campaigns, including against Britain. In 1940, the signing at Compiègne was more than a treaty. It was revenge, symbolism, and a declaration of German dominance, sealing the fate of France for years to come.
On June 10, 1940, while France was already reeling from the German Blitzkrieg, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Though Italy's military contribution was limited, its entry into the conflict complicated an already desperate situation for the French. Italian forces launched attacks across the Alpine frontier, targeting fortifications and mountain passes. The French army, stretched thin and demoralized by the German advance, struggled to mount an effective defense. Even minor Italian pressure forced French commanders to divert troops and resources from the main fronts in the north and west. Italy's late entry also added political and psychological pressure. French leaders faced the reality of a second enemy while the northern front collapsed. The prospect of fighting both Germany and Italy accelerated decision-making toward surrender as continued resistance seemed increasingly futile. Although Italian forces achieved few decisive victories, their involvement magnified the sense of encirclement and vulnerability. The French government and military leadership recognized that prolonged resistance could only lead to greater civilian and military casualties. In the end, Italy's entry into the war didn't win battles, it exacerbated the collapse, forcing France to confront a multi-front threat while morale, logistics, and command systems were already in crisis. It was a final blow that made the surrender of France inevitable, highlighting how timing and pressure, even without major combat, can influence the outcome of a war.
During the 1940 campaign, The alliance between Britain and France was strained by conflicting strategies, mistrust, and miscommunication. These tensions significantly weakened the Allied response to Germany's Blitzkrieg. The French believed in holding the front line in Belgium, following the Dyle plan, while the British favored a more flexible, defensive approach. This divergence created coordination problems, with units arriving late, misaligned, or out of position. Decisions that required joint action were delayed or contradictory, reducing the effectiveness of combined operations. Communication difficulties exacerbated the problem. Language barriers, separate command structures, and differing priorities slowed information flow. French generals often resented British intervention, while British commanders feared being drawn into French mistakes. Differences in military doctrine further complicated cooperation. French forces emphasized static defenses and methodical planning, while the British valued mobility and evacuation strategies. In a fast-moving campaign, these differences created gaps and hesitation that the Germans exploited with devastating efficiency. Psychologically, tensions undermined morale. Both nations questioned whether the other could be relied upon, feeding mistrust and uncertainty. This lack of unity contributed to chaotic retreats, slower reinforcements, and ultimately the isolation of French and British forces in northern France. The failure to achieve real coordination in 1940 highlights a critical lesson. Alliance strength depends not just on numbers, but on shared strategy and trust. In the Battle of France, divergent visions turned a powerful coalition into a fragmented and vulnerable front, accelerating the collapse.
As Germany overran metropolitan France in 1940, some argued that the war could continue from France's colonies in North Africa. The vast territories, including Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, offered manpower, resources, and ports for Allied operations, but the reality was far more complicated. French forces in North Africa were numerically significant and well-equipped, but they faced severe limitations. Communication with metropolitan France was disrupted, supply lines were vulnerable, and morale was already shaken by the rapid collapse in Europe. Commanders debated whether continued resistance was feasible or merely symbolic. Political considerations were even more decisive. The newly established Vichy government, under Marshal Petain, sought to maintain French sovereignty and avoid further bloodshed. Supporting continued fighting from North Africa risked provoking Germany and Italy, potentially bringing the colonies into direct conflict without adequate support. Allied coordination was another challenge. Britain was willing to cooperate with Free French forces, but North African forces were not fully aligned with London's strategy. Fragmentation and mistrust limited the potential for an organized, effective resistance. While some units eventually joined the Free French under Charles de Gaulle in 1940, the immediate continuation of the war from North Africa was not politically or militarily viable. The colonies provided a future base for liberation efforts, but at the time, France's defeat seemed total and the resources to continue the fight independently were insufficient. In the end, the question was not just military capability, it was political will, coordination, and the reality of a nation in collapse. North Africa would later play a key role in the war, but in 1940, France's opportunity to continue fighting from abroad had effectively passed.
By June 1940, France, Europe's largest army on paper, had collapsed under the German Blitzkrieg. How could a nation so powerful fall in just 6 weeks? The answer lies in a combination of strategy, doctrine, technology, and morale. 1. Strategic misjudgments. French and British commanders expected a repeat of World War I, focusing on holding Belgium and relying on the Maginot Line. They were surprised by Germany's rapid Ardennes advance, which bypassed the strongest defenses and cut France in half. 2. Doctrinal failures. French forces emphasized static defense and methodical planning, while Germany mastered mobile, combined arms warfare. French tanks were often dispersed and underused, and infantry could not react quickly to fast-moving armored thrusts. 3. Communication chaos. French radios were outdated or absent in many units, leaving troops unable to coordinate effectively. German units, fully equipped with radios, maintained real-time communication and adaptability on the battlefield. 4. Allied disunity. Differing strategies between Britain and France, delayed decisions, and mutual mistrust left a cohesive response. Belgium's surrender and the Dutch collapse left gaps the Allies couldn't plug. 5. Logistics and morale. Civilian refugee columns, traffic congestion, and disrupted supply lines immobilized units. Panic spread among troops, while rapid German advances created psychological shock, accelerating retreat and disorganization. 6. Leadership and politics. Commanders were indecisive, and political leaders faced impossible choices. Marshal Petain's rise and the subsequent Armistice ended organized resistance, turning military collapse into national defeat. In 6 weeks, France's strengths were neutralized by speed, coordination, and adaptability, all areas where the Germans excelled. It wasn't just the enemy, it was strategy, technology, communication, morale, and leadership failures combined. France fell quickly because it fought the last war with outdated assumptions, while Germany fought the war of the future.